500,000 dead, 12 million displaced, the 10-year-long war in Syria, and still no end in sight. A harsh winter and coronavirus are adding to the misery and the death toll. So what's the future for Syria? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Peter Dobbie. Now, the war in Syria is heading into its 11th year, marking more than a decade of fighting, and with no sign it is coming to an end. The conflict has displaced millions of people and killed around 500,000. It's also torn Syria into rival areas controlled by different groups, backed by regional or international players. And the country is also now facing a surge in COVID-19 cases, an economic crisis, and new US sanctions targeting the government of President Bashar al-Assad. All this has left the situation increasingly desperate for Syrians who remain in the country and many of those who've sought shelter elsewhere. Around 6.6 million have fled the country since the war began, while another 6.1 million are displaced inside Syria. The UN is calling it the worst man-made disaster since World War II. In November, the UN said urgent relief aid was required for at least 3 million people, particularly in the provinces of Idlib and Aleppo. Many don't have adequate shelter, heating fuel, or even blankets to help them survive the winter. More than 9.3 million people are suffering from food insecurity, up by almost 1.5 million compared to last year. And the number of children going hungry is now more than 4.5 million. For more on that, let's bring in our guests today here on Inside Story. In Washington, we have Kenan Rahmani, advocacy manager of the Syria Campaign, a human rights organisation. In Milton Keynes in the UK, Amar Wakaf, director of Gnosis, a Middle East-focused think tank. Also in the United States, in Oklahoma, we have Joshua Landis, director of the Center for Middle East Studies, and Sandra, Mackey, chair at the University of Oklahoma. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. Kenan Rahmani, coming to you first there in Washington. Is any one side actually winning the war in Syria as of today?
Well, as we sit here today, almost 10 years after Syrians took to the streets protesting for democracy and basic human rights, I think what we can all agree on is that the Syrian people have lost the most. 500,000 people have been killed as a result of the unrestrained brutality of the Assad regime. And, I don't think anyone can say that there's a winner in all of this. The Assad regime is still the same corrupt, brutal regime that it was 10 years ago. It's taken control now of nearly 60% of the Syrian territory. But this isn't just about the military. This is about the immense human suffering and loss of life that is a result of the regime's unwillingness to concede even the most basic human rights to its own people.
Amar Wakaf in Milton Keynes there in the UK. This outgoing current US administration, it's kind of gone silent on Syria in the past few months, but it has, up to 3 or 4 months ago, liked to tout its gains, its successes against ISIL. Will those gains stay in place?
Well, we don't think it was gains against ISIS or ISIL. It was gains against the Syrian population. The normal or the average salary has become 1/30 of what it was prior to the crisis, and that is mainly because of the sanctions, the incremental sanctions. I've just been to Syria in the past few weeks, and it's really horrendous. People cannot find means, to stay alive, let alone all the corona pandemic or whatever. So we don't think, I personally don't think that the United States ever had ISIS as its first priority in Syria, not until now, the least now. They just want their own geopolitical influence. They could see Russians coming in, and they wanted to oppose that, which is fine, but this is happening at the expense of a lot of Syrians, and they are suffering.
Joshua Landis there in Oklahoma. Bill Roebuck, who may yet not go back, he's currently US envoy. He said in the past week or so that the humanitarian situation is, and I quote, under control. What we're seeing out of Syria today doesn't look like a humanitarian situation that is under control.
No, it's not under control. And in fact, Bill Roebuck, in a long interview today, made it very clear that there is huge amounts of damage. He said in the Northeast, where America has some real influence, he said cutting off reconstruction and has been terrible for that area. He said many people see the United States and the coalition as responsible for withdrawing without rebuilding. And he said the agriculture is the main basis for the economy there. And he said tons of irrigation and other infrastructure has been destroyed, and it hasn't been rebuilt. And this is a situation across Syria. And as your other guests have said, the sanctions, although they're not the primary reason for the devastation, clearly they just are, they're very hard to rebuild Syria with these sanctions. I think the U.S. policy, there'll have to be a real reevaluation of what's going on in the policy of Europe and the United States towards Syria, because as long as it can't rebuild, Lebanon's economy is going to be weak, Jordan's weak, and Iraq is going to be weak. The entire region needs Syria to be rebuilding. And as long as it's being punished like this, there won't be rebuilding in the entire region.
Amar in Milton Keynes, coming back to you. Can we talk, I mean, I guess it's kind of counterintuitive, about areas to do with the Syrian conflict that lead directly to the humanitarian tragedy, that people would say, because they're a supporter of the peace effort such as it is, that they are positives. Point number one, the US has managed to keep the SDF mainly, in the main, on board, but only because the SDF reacted in a non-predictable way to action that the United States wanted to take on the ground in Syria.
I didn't get any, well, I didn't get exactly what you're aiming at. Is there a specific example where you could verify that question with or qualify it with?
Because Donald Trump signaled very clearly, OK, actually, we will stay in Syria.
Yeah, well, fair enough. Basically, the United States, it's not about the SDF. It's just about making use of a situation where they can counter, the United States that is, they could counter a Russian influence or a Russian increasing influence. They don't want to leave Syria to be all rosy for Russians so that they don't expand more into the Middle East, which is traditionally a US territory. Now, the SDF are being used. Obviously, the SDF are happy with the support they're getting from the United States, but they need to realize that their own project doesn't abode well with the rest of the Syrians. The whole or the entire notion of having one ethnicity or one group of people being specific or more specific about their culture than everybody else is so devastating in Syria. And there are all sorts of hidden issues that we cannot really see, because the Arabs in that area are feeling very nervous. And one could argue it is because of the American presence over there that the Arabs are not causing so much trouble. Once the American presence is out, then it could be in the Biden administration, it could be later on, we don't know. This could actually have they could actually have a backlash. So did the United States do a very good job over there? I could argue from the rest of Syria's point of view, all they did is to prevent the Syrian people from their bread and butter. The Syrian people cannot extract oil, they cannot get wheat, they cannot, insufficient that is, quantities, and they have now to import what they were exporting 10 years earlier. And this has really added to the problems that the people are having. And the whole notion of it, I would argue again, is that people need to disengage from the government. So the whole sanctions isn't about punishing the Assad regime, it's about drawing people or pushing people to the limit so that they can disengage, or they would disengage from their government. And I personally cannot see that happening anywhere soon.
Kenan Rahmani in Washington. Has Amar Wakaf in Milton Keynes there hit on another reality here? And just in the past week or so, the authorities in Damascus are saying we are going to have to stop fuel distribution by 1/4. So that's making people's lives even worse than they were before. And you're talking about an economy that's highly centralized. So if you're in Damascus, you're okay. in effect, you're okay. If you're outside Damascus, any place else in the country, that has a major impact on how you exist and how you live day to day.
Well, certainly there is a huge humanitarian suffering right now. The economy, the budget for 2021 is just a little under 1/3 of what it was. This year is around $3 billion. Last year was around $9 billion. Definitely the Syrian economy is reeling after almost 10 years of war. But let's not forget, this is because the Syrian government decided to destroy around 40% of its own infrastructure, decided to displace more than half of its own population and force millions of people to take refuge outside the country. The Syrian pound was plummeting last year when the regime decided to launch an offensive into Idlib and potentially force the displacement of 3 million people who live in the northwest part of the country. So these are decisions that are being taken again and again by the Syrian regime to prioritize not giving the Syrian people any ounce of their basic human rights, forcing any kind of opposition and dissent into its dungeons, where people are still to this day arrested and tortured and raped in Syrian prison cells. These are the decisions of the Syrian government, and the international community must continue to step up to provide humanitarian assistance to help those who are in the most need. But the primary responsibility for all of this falls on the Assad regime and its allies.
Joshua, just to go back to a point that you mentioned earlier about Lebanon, is Bashar al-Assad's plan basically to sit tight? He's overseeing a country now where half the population has been displaced. Big parts of the country are not under his control. There's a fiscal crisis in Lebanon, and Iran is under more and more sanctions. And a lot, if not all, of the Syrian oil that he needs in Damascus comes from or through Iran.
Yes, Assad's not going anywhere. He's fought this war in order to win. Unfortunately, Syria is, as we know, is extremely divided along ethnic and sectarian and regional lines, just the way Iraq and Lebanon are. And no one group is going to lay down their arms because they fear they're going to be slaughtered. And that's what we've been seeing going on in Syria now for the last 10 years. And he's not going to lay down his arms now that he's largely won this war. And the international community, unfortunately, is going to have to deal with him as the Arabs are as well. And, the United States and Europe has thought that putting more and more economic pressure on Assad is going to force him to lay down his arms and to accept the opposition into government. But that we clearly can see is not going to happen. And that leaves the international community with a terrible dilemma. Do they want to continue these sanctions? We know what the result will be. It will be just like it was on Iraq in the 1990s, where almost 500,000 people died from sanctions, according to the UN investigators. And that's the dilemma. In many ways, the West has lost this war to overturn the Assad regime and to punish Iran and to push back Russia. And where do we go from here? Can they accept this and begin to bring diplomacy back in, which I think is the only way forward? And of course, people don't want to do that. And we're in this, the Syrian people are suffering as a result because this has really gotten out of their hands and it's become an intractable international struggle for power. And that's the dilemma we face today.
Amma Wakaf, there was, just to go back to that idea of the international community stepping up, as it were, there was an international EU donor conference at the end of last year, late last year, but with minimal Russian and Turkish involvement. If the international community is going to turn up and do the right thing by the people who've suffered so much, how can that happen if the Russians and the Turks, in effect, look the other way for the duration of another conference?
Well, were Russia and Turkey welcome to that conference? I seriously doubt it. I think, the international community lives in two worlds. You have Russia and Turkey cooperating a lot on what is happening in Syria. And let us not forget that since they launched the Astana process in 2017, a lot of the bloodshed has, gone down. There's a lot of stability and so on. But the West, so to speak, the Europeans, and especially the Americans, and especially with the latest legislation called the Caesar Act, they stepped up sanctions. And these sanctions are biting, and they are going to bite even a little bit more. But let me go back to some of the notions that your good guests, the gentlemen, pointed out. Well, first of all, I think lots of people do not probably realize that there is something that is called the Assad constituency, i.e. the people who from day one refused to participate, either to participate in the revolution, so to speak, or actually stood against it. And those people took that decision because they thought it would be better not for the government not to fall down. Their calculus hasn't changed. It would be very hard for them to convince them, it would be very hard to convince them that if Assad goes now, then everything is going to be great. So the pressure that is being mounted on them, unbearable pressure that is going to lead nowhere. Moreover, a lot of them feel that they have suffered a lot, that they have lost so many loved ones, so as to keep their position in whatever Syria is. They're not going to concede on things. Let me give you an example. And going back to what Mr. Landis said, it's not only sectarian lines, and actually I would argue against that. It's pretty much all societies have been split in half. Take Ghouta, for example, which is the eastern area, rural area around Damascus. Now, this has gone back to government control last year. There is nothing to suggest, there is no evidence whatsoever to suggest that people in that area at this moment in time would want those who fled to Idlib to come back. Why? Because at the beginning, there were lots of people who, they were like middle class, they were okay with the government, they just lived okay. And the marginalized, they made an uprising against them. And things are not easy. You could see this in Daraa, you could see this in Eastern Ghouta, you could see this in Aleppo versus rural. So it's urban versus rural, it's within all societies. So those people do not want to give up what they thought that they gained through hard work. And let us remember that this constituency isn't around ethnic lines or sectarian lines. It's each society within itself. So how to solve that? It's not easy at all. And to keep punishing those people and to tell them that Assad is the bad choice, and unless you do something about it, you go into a fresh uprising or whatever it is, your life are going to be worse, when they know that their lives are going to be worse if the government falls and all hell breaks loose again. Okay. Then I think they're being punished without a reason.
Okay, let's just go back to Kenan Rahmani in Washington. Are there two factors coming together here? Factor number one, there's a political malaise outside Syria. Those people that would be involved or were involved in the Geneva peace process and also the Astana process. And that malaise is coming together with contrived inertia on the part of Bashar al-Assad.
Well, I think what we can all agree on is that the international community has to step up more to reach a political solution in Syria that ends all of the brutality we've seen from the past 10 years and also ends the humanitarian situation and the economic situation that we're seeing today. There needs to be a transition to a more inclusive government in Damascus that does not have the participation of those who have committed heinous war crimes against their own people. And there has to be reconstruction investment from primarily the West, the United States, Europe, to make Syria suitable once again for its own citizens and for refugees to be able to return there. But I just want to, point out one thing. When we're talking about Eastern Ghouta here, the previous guest, Mr. Wakaf, talked about Eastern Ghouta. This is an area in which the Assad regime had besieged over 1 million people for years, was not even allowing UN humanitarian trucks into that area for years. This is the same place where the Assad regime launched sarin gas attacks in 2013 and killed over 1,000 people. So it's not as if this is an international conflict and now people are divided and there are sanctions. This is the result of the Assad regime's brutality, use of chemical weapons, detaining innocent people and torturing them in prisons, dropping barrel bombs on hospitals. And these are the consequences now that the Assad regime is taking control of these areas, it is much more difficult to find a solution when the government is responsible for this scale of atrocities and war crimes.
Joshua Landis in Oklahoma, instability here in the context of Syria is a byword for more death, more destruction, more displacement, more people being detained, more people being tortured. Clearly, stability will not come out of a military process, whether it's militia fighting militia or anyone else involved in the military conflict. It's got to be diplomatic/political. Who will drive that bus towards stability, not instability?
You know, the statement that these are the consequences that Syria is facing, I don't think is a productive way to look at this, because nobody is going to drive political change in Syria today from outside the country. The United States has largely washed its hands of Syria. And Russia and Iran have made it clear that they're not going to pressure Assad to step down from power. And that's the dilemma. There is not going to be major political change in the region, not in Jordan, not in Lebanon, not in Iraq, and not in Syria. All of these governments have resisted change. And despite efforts on the United States and an international coalition to bring about regime change, profound regime change, and a freedom agenda, as President Bush brought about, and reform of the greater Middle East, it's not happened. In fact, what's happened is the United States helped to kick off a terrible civil war in both Iraq and Syria, and now Libya and other places, because in the search for this democracy, where the United States didn't find enough partners and clearly got spooked by the Syrian opposition, which turned out to be much more Islamist and not democratic. And the number of Democrats, unfortunately, was too few to really lead the opposition in a united movement for democracy. None of the slogans in the beginning of the Syrian civil war were for democracy.
Okay, Joshua, I'm going to pause you there because we're heading very quickly towards the end of the programme. I just want to get in a couple of final points. Ammar Wakaf in Milton Keynes. As of January the 1st this year, an estimated 13.6 million people in Syria need ongoing humanitarian aid. That's a hellish number, but it's 2 million more than this time last year. So it's gone up by 2 million in 12 months. That's simply not sustainable.
No, it's not. But, ending on a positive note, perhaps, for everyone, we can see some movement within the Arab world about finding some way or some halfway, meeting the Syrian government halfway. This is started in Cairo, I think like a couple of months back now, or a little bit less. And apparently those Arabs are just talking to the Syrian people, where could we meet halfway? And then probably the objective is, or the initiative is to take that sort of bundle into and put it in the hands of the new American administration and say, look, this is a stalemate. Nobody's going to reach anywhere, because everybody is so much entrenched and the people are suffering. Can we move this a little bit about? But again, I would like to reiterate this very key point. If you just think of what keeps the Syrian government on its feet, and let's just call that the Assad constituency, and it is amalgamation of lots of people, lots of ethnic backgrounds, but main interest for the government not to fall. Nothing is going to happen until they are convinced in a solution. The Syrian government is not it will not be able to impose, for example, a reconciliation out of thin air with a supposed opposition or whatever. Nothing is going to happen until that group of people accept it. And I'm going to give you a very swift example. The Syrian government, because of the Abraham Accords, finds itself at the moment in a very isolated situation. And the natural thing to do is to go to Hamas and the Palestinians and try to mend bridges. This is being blocked by the public opinion of that group of people, i.e. this constituency. And this is now entrusted, this idea of rejoining with Hamas is entrusted to Hassan Nasrallah, the Hezbollah leader, who happens to have some popularity, a lot of popularity actually, still inside Syria. But again, it's not happening. So appeasing these group of people who have personal issues with their neighbors, with their others, is the key thing. And it's not going to happen soon, unfortunately.
Gentlemen, we have to leave it there. Thank you to our guests, Kenan Rahmani, Amma Wakaf and Joshua Landis. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime via the website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Peter Dobbie, and the team here in Doha, thanks for watching. We will see you very soon. For the moment, bye-bye.